I got a disturbing message from a serial killer's wife. What happened next will shock you. What would you do if you found out that you weren't just a victim, but a pawn in a deadly game? The truth behind the Lori Show murder case is darker than you could ever imagine. Stay tuned until the end, because you won't believe the shocking twist that changes everything. The phone buzzed in the quiet of the night. I was alone, sitting at my desk. It was an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen. Something felt wrong, but I swiped it open. Please help me. He's coming for me. The message was simple. Too simple. My heart skipped a beat. The name that followed chilled me. It was her, the wife of the serial killer. I remembered the case, the headlines. A murder spree that had shaken the city. She was the one who had disappeared. The one who never spoke publicly. The one who was rumored to have known everything. I stared at the phone, waiting for more. Nothing came. I rubbed my eyes, unsure if this was a prank, but the fear in her words felt real. I glanced around my room. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than usual. The air felt thicker, heavier. I wasn't alone anymore. The phone buzzed again. My heart raced as I read the next line. He knows I'm trying to escape. I stood up, my legs unsteady. A cold sweat ran down my back. How had she found me? Why me? I didn't respond. I had to think. I felt like I was being watched. I moved to the window and pulled the curtain slightly. A figure stood across the street, his face hidden in the darkness. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced. Was it him? I looked at the phone again. There was another message. I need you to help me leave. The hairs on my neck stood up. The street light flickered. It was too quiet. I felt the weight of the situation sink in. This wasn't just some desperate plea. It was a warning. I typed back. Where are you? Her reply came quickly. I'm close. Don't trust anyone. Then the phone went dead. I stared at the screen. I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was wrong. Very wrong. A knock echoed from my door. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. Who could it be at this hour? I slowly moved toward the door. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder. They stopped. The silence was deafening. I gripped the doorknob, my hand trembling. Was it him? Or someone else? I swallowed hard. I wasn't ready for what came next, that I took a deep breath, my fingers still gripping the doorknob. The footsteps outside were now completely still. For a moment, everything felt too quiet. Then a whisper, barely audible. Open the door. My blood ran cold. It was a woman's voice. I could hardly move, frozen in place. I stepped back slowly, my mind racing. Could it be her? The wife. But why would she be here? I glanced at my phone. No new messages. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The whisper came again, louder this time. Please, you have to let me in. I swallowed hard, then took one step toward the door. I wasn't sure what to expect. I reached for the handle. The door opened just slightly. I peeked through the crack, but no one was there. Only darkness. The air outside felt thick, oppressive. The streetlight flickered again, casting a dim glow. My heart was racing. What was happening? Suddenly I heard it, a sound from behind me. I spun around. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. Tall, looming. I could barely make out the features in the dim light, but there was something about them, the way they stood. It felt wrong. Who are you? I gasped, my voice shaking. No answer. Just silence. I took a step back, my mind clouded with confusion. The figure remained still. My phone buzzed again. I hesitated, but then grabbed it. The message was from the same number. It read, "It's too late now." A chill ran down my spine. I turned back to the figure. Their face was now clearer, illuminated by the faint light. I froze. It wasn't her. It wasn't him either. It was someone else. Someone I had never seen before. The figure smiled. A cold, empty smile. My stomach turned. Then the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I stepped back, fear rising in my chest. How did they know? How did they know I'd opened it? Before I could react, they moved forward fast. Too fast. I turned to run, but something cold wrapped around my wrist. It was a grip. Tight. Unrelenting. I spun back around. The figure was now inches from my face, their breath cold against my skin. "Run," they whispered. "If you can." Then everything went black. That I woke up in a haze. My head throbbed. The room was dark, unfamiliar. I blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening. Where was I? I tried to move, but my hands were tied. Panic surged through me. I tugged at the ropes, but they were tight. My breath quickened. I looked around. A dim light flickered from the corner of the room. I could make out the shape of a chair in front of me. It was empty. I strained to hear. There was a faint sound of movement. Footsteps. Someone was nearby. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then a voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't have gotten involved." It was him, the figure from before. My heart slammed against my chest. Where was the wife? Why was I here? I looked up, trying to gather my thoughts. He stepped into the light. His face was pale, expressionless. I could see a faint smudge of blood on his shirt. The fear in my chest grew tighter. He came closer, his eyes fixed on me. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked softly. I couldn't answer. My mouth was dry. The truth crashed into me. The wife, she had used me. She'd led me right into this. I hadn't been trying to help her. I had been part of the trap all along. His lips curled into a cruel smile. "She made you think you were saving her," he whispered. "But she knew exactly what she was doing. She led you to me." I tried to speak, to ask why, but the words wouldn't come. I was choking on the truth. He knelt down in front of me, his eyes cold. "Do you really think she was trying to escape?" he asked. I shook my head, unable to speak. "You're not the first one to fall for her lies." The door behind him creaked open. Another figure stepped into the room. It was her, the wife. She was different now, her eyes cold like his. She looked at me almost amused. "I told you," she said softly. "I need your help." My stomach dropped. I had been used. The trap was set from the beginning. They had been playing me all along. My mind raced. How was I going to get out of this? But there was no escape. I knew that now. The room grew darker, the air thick with dread. The last thing I heard was the sound of the door locking behind me, that I was trapped, completely trapped. My mind screamed for a way out, but every exit seemed blocked. The wife and the killer stood there, like shadows in the dark. Her cold eyes never left mine. I could see the faintest hint of a smirk on her lips. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her voice almost gentle. "You never were." I fought against the ropes, desperate. I had to escape, but every move I made felt like a futile effort. The man took a step forward, his presence overpowering. His eyes locked onto mine, cold and unwavering. "She told you to help her," he whispered. But what she really needed was someone to blame. I didn't understand. I stared at him, confused, trying to piece it together. "She needed someone to take the fall," he continued. "Someone to point the finger at." The truth slowly began to sink in. She hadn't wanted my help. She had wanted a scapegoat, and I had been the perfect choice. The silence in the room thickened. I could hear my breath quickening. The wife's smile widened, watching my realization unfold. "You were the one who got too curious," she said. You dug too deep. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. What had I gotten myself into? I didn't mean to. I started to speak, but the words felt useless. The walls were closing in. The man stepped closer, his breath hot on my face. "Don't worry," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "It'll all make sense soon enough." I turned my head, looking around for anything to break free. But the room was empty, cold, and suffocating. The door was locked. The windows were sealed. There was no way out. And then the unthinkable happened. The wife moved toward me slowly, deliberately. I could see the darkness in her eyes, the same darkness that had consumed the man beside her. She was no longer the victim I had thought she was. She was a predator. "I needed you to trust me," she said softly, "but you didn't. Now, you're going to help me finish what we started." I felt a wave of panic rise within me. Her words didn't make sense, but the fear was real. I had been caught in a dangerous game, and I was the one who had lost. The killer stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "You'll regret this," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I meant it for them or for myself. But I knew it didn't matter. The moment I walked into this, I sealed my fate. There would be no turning back, that I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, cold and unforgiving. My throat felt tight, my body trembling in a mixture of fear and disbelief. The wife took a step closer, her heels clicking on the concrete floor like a ticking clock. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said softly, almost pityingly. "You were never supposed to save me." Her words echoed in my mind, a cruel truth sinking in. I wasn't part of the plan. I was the distraction. I had been the bait, the one who would divert attention, while they worked in the shadows, orchestrating their final act. "You thought you were doing good," she continued, her voice cold. "But you've only helped us move closer to our goal." I struggled against the ropes again, my heart racing, but it only tightened the knots further. The man stepped forward, his eyes burning with something dark and twisted. "We needed someone to trust us. Someone naive," he muttered. "And you were perfect." The room felt smaller now, suffocating. I had been nothing more than a pawn in their game, and now there was no way out. My mind raced. What had I done wrong? How had I been so blind? Then the killer moved toward the door and paused. "Now that you're here," he said with a grin that made my stomach turn, "we can finish it." The door creaked open behind him, and I heard the sound of something scraping against the ground. I couldn't see what it was, but I didn't want to. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. The wife stood motionless, her eyes cold and calculating. I could hear the man's footsteps retreating, the sound growing distant. I didn't know what he was doing, but I could feel the danger closing in. My mind screamed for action, any way to fight back, but the fear paralyzed me. "I won't let you do this," I spat, my voice weak but defiant. She leaned in, her face inches from mine. "You already have." And with that, she turned and walked toward the door, leaving me in the suffocating silence. I could hear them speaking softly outside, their voices indistinguishable. I strained to listen, my pulse racing. They're talking about the next part, the final stage of their plan. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I had to warn someone. I tugged again at the ropes, pulling with all my strength. But they didn't budge. Frustration welled up inside me. I was running out of time. Suddenly, the door slammed open again. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The man stepped back in, his face unreadable. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low. And before I could respond, he grabbed me by the arms, pulling me to my feet. The wife was standing just behind him, her eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice like ice. The darkness of the room swallowed me whole. And then, Everything went silent. I felt the chill of the room seep deeper into my bones. The air had become suffocating, thick with a sense of impending doom. They had me in their grip, like a bird caught in a net. My mind raced, trying to calculate my next move, but the fear paralyzed me. The killer's hand was tight around my arm, unrelenting. The wife watched with an eerie calmness, her eyes never leaving mine. "Do you understand now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. I shook my head, struggling to piece together the fragments of this nightmare. She smiled coldly. "You're not the hero here. You never were." I could feel the weight of her words crushing me, and I realized the horrible truth. There was no way out. I had been foolish, thinking I could help, thinking I could be the one to stop this. But they had planned it all along. They were the ones pulling the strings. "You were just a tool," she continued, her voice almost soothing. "Just like everyone else." The man behind me shifted, his grip tightening as he dragged me forward. I stumbled, trying to stay upright, but my body felt weak, useless. "Where are we going?" I gasped, my voice strained. "To finish what we started," the man muttered. The last part of the plan, I didn't know what they were talking about, but a gut-wrenching fear began to settle in my stomach. The plan, it wasn't over yet. They had something more in store for me. I tried to fight against the grip on my arms, but it was futile. They pulled me toward the door, and I caught a glimpse of the hallway outside. It was empty, too quiet. And then I saw something, a glint of metal on the floor. My heart skipped a beat. It was a knife. I had seen it before. It was one of the knives the killer had used in his spree. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was going to be a part of this, not a savior, but a victim, a pawn in their twisted game. As they moved me down the hallway, I could feel my strength draining, but my mind was still racing. I had to think, had to act fast. I glanced around, looking for anything that might give me a chance. But it was too late. They had led me into a room. I didn't recognize it. The walls were bare, cold, and the air smelled of damp earth. I was shoved forward, my legs giving way beneath me. The wife stepped closer, her eyes cold with finality. "It's time," she whispered. The door slammed shut behind me, and in that moment I knew I had no escape. No one was coming. I was alone. And this was the end. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in my chest. I could hear the lock click into place behind me, sealing me in. The room was dark, save for a faint sliver of light coming from a crack in the corner of the room. I looked around, my heart pounding. There was nowhere to run. I was alone, trapped in this cold, suffocating place. My breath quickened, panic rising like a wave. What were they going to do to me? I could hear footsteps outside, the soft, deliberate sound of them moving away, and then silence. I tried to steady my breath, my mind reeling with the reality of my situation. I wasn't just some random victim. I had become part of their sick plan. I could still hear the wife's voice in my head. Asterisk, you're not the hero here. Asterisk. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I needed to get out. I needed to find a way. I scrambled to my feet, my hands still bound. But as I moved toward the crack of light, I heard something. A voice. Faint at first, like a whisper in the distance. I froze. It was coming from behind the walls. A muffled, desperate sound. Someone else was here. My heart raced again, faster this time. Who else was trapped in this place? I pressed my ear to the cold, damp wall. The voice was clearer now, more distinct. A man. A voice I recognized. It was his, the killer's. He was speaking to someone, but I couldn't make out the words. I strained to listen, my breath shallow, and then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of metal scraping against the floor. A sharp, sudden noise. I backed away from the wall, my body tense. What were they doing? What was he planning now? I could feel the walls closing in tighter. The air grew heavier, the scent of decay mixing with the cold dampness of the room. I couldn't stay here. I had to find a way out. Suddenly, the door creaked open again. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The figure of the man stepped into the room, silhouetted by the dim light. He wasn't alone. The wife followed him, her expression unreadable. I could barely breathe as they moved closer. She smiled at me, that same cold, empty smile. "Did you think you could run?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You really thought you had a chance?" I opened my mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. The man stepped forward, his gaze locking onto mine. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're already part of this." I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in on me with every step they took. I could hear the distant sound of chains rattling, the metal scraping against the floor again. My mind was reeling. What had they done? What had they set in motion? I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I was powerless. They were closing in, their movements slow, deliberate. And then the wife spoke again, her voice soft, almost like a lullaby. "It's time to finish what we started." And then everything went dark. The darkness swallowed me whole, a heavy, suffocating void that pressed against my chest. I tried to fight it, but my limbs felt heavy like lead. I was still aware of them, their presence looming over me, but the world around me had faded into nothingness. Time lost all meaning. I wasn't sure how long I had been out. When I finally regained my senses, I felt a sharp pain at the back of my head. I jolted awake, my vision blurry, the edges of the room still swimming before me. I was still bound, but now I was no longer in the small, dark room. I was in another place, larger, colder. I could hear the faint sound of machinery running in the distance. The walls around me were concrete, stained with rust. It felt like a basement, abandoned, forgotten. The air smelled of mildew and something worse, something rotting. I tried to move, but my wrists were tied to a chair, forcing me to sit upright. I could feel the strain in my muscles as I tugged against the restraints. I looked around, my mind still foggy, but I couldn't see them yet. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline slowly starting to flood my system. They had done something to me. I knew it. I had to get out of here. I had to think. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, measured. The killer's voice followed, distant but clear. "You woke up too soon." I froze. I couldn't tell where he was, but I could feel him getting closer. I turned my head toward the sound, my breath coming in quick gasps. The wife's laughter cut through the silence, chilling me to the core. "Did you really think we'd let you go?" she asked. "After everything?" I didn't know what she meant by that. I didn't want to know, but I could hear the sick satisfaction in her tone, the finality of her words. I tugged again at the ropes, my heart racing. The more I struggled, the more the ropes dug into my skin. I had to escape. I had to find a way to get free before they did whatever twisted thing they planned. The door creaked open, and I braced myself, expecting the worst. But what I saw made my blood run cold. The killer stepped into the room, his face twisted in a grin that sent chills down my spine. Behind him, the wife appeared, her gaze cold and emotionless. They were standing side by side, watching me with eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to scream, to beg them to let me go, but I knew that would do nothing. They had no mercy. "Do you know what happens now?" the man asked, stepping closer. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. He was toying with me, playing a sick game. "You'll never get away with this," I spat, my voice trembling but defiant. The wife smiled, stepping forward, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, but we already have," she said softly. Then she gestured behind her, toward the shadows at the back of the room. I couldn't see what it was at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. A table covered in tools, blood-stained, sharp. I felt my stomach churn. I knew what they intended. It wasn't just about me anymore. They weren't just playing games. I was part of something darker, something much worse. The killer reached out and gripped my chin, tilting my head up to meet his eyes. "Now," he whispered, "it's your turn." And the door slammed shut behind me. The sound final. The light blinded me for a moment, sharp and unforgiving. I stumbled backward, my legs weak beneath me, but the voice was like a lifeline. "Get down!" The command came again, louder this time, and filled with urgency. Without thinking, I dropped to the floor, covering my head with my arms instinctively. Gunshots rang out. I could hear the killer's screams, and the sound of chaos erupted around me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the noise, my heart racing. Was this real? Was I dreaming? Had someone come to save me? Another shot fired, then another. The wife's voice shrieked in panic, but it was cut short. Everything happened so quickly, too quickly for me to fully process. I dared to open my eyes. Just a crack, peeking through my arms. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the harsh light behind them. It was a man, dressed in black tactical gear. His face was hidden behind a mask, but I could see the steady, controlled movements as he advanced into the room. The killer was on the floor, bleeding, groaning in pain, but still alive. The wife was on her knees, hands raised in surrender, her eyes wide with terror. But I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. "Stay down," the man ordered, his voice calm but commanding. I couldn't form words, my mouth dry, and my mind in a fog. The tactical officer didn't take his eyes off the killer and the wife as he approached me, pulling a small knife from his belt and cutting the ropes that bound me to the chair. I winced at the sudden movement of my arms, but I didn't dare complain. The officer's hands were steady, efficient. "Are you hurt?" he asked, glancing at my bruised wrists. I shook my head, unable to speak at first. I wasn't sure if I could. His eyes studied me for a moment before he nodded. "Good. Stay here." He moved quickly, his attention turning to the wife and the killer. Another officer appeared, and they moved in, securing the two of them with handcuffs, ignoring their cries and protests. I sat there on the cold floor, trying to process the madness around me. I was alive. I had survived. But the question burned in my mind. How had they found me? The officer who had saved me seemed to read my thoughts. He turned to me, his face still hidden behind the mask. "We've been tracking them for months," he explained, his voice surprisingly soft. "When you contacted us, we knew you were in danger. We just couldn't get to you in time." I felt a rush of relief, mixed with disbelief. "I didn't know," I whispered, my voice shaky. "I didn't know what they were planning. I was just trying to help." The officer nodded, his gaze sympathetic. "You were caught in something much bigger than you could have imagined." I wanted to speak, to ask more questions, but my throat was too tight. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the exhaustion hit me all at once. I let out a shaky breath, staring at the two criminals, now restrained and helpless. The nightmare was over, but somehow it felt like I had just stepped into another world, one where nothing would ever be the same again. I sat there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. The room felt both empty and suffocating at the same time. I could still hear the faint cries of the killer and his wife, now in the grip of the officers, but it seemed distant, like it belonged to another world entirely. The weight of everything that had happened crashed down on me. My hands shook as I slowly wiped my face, realizing just how much blood was on my skin. My own, their blood. I didn't even know. The officer who had freed me stepped closer, kneeling down to my level. His voice softened, but I could hear the urgency underneath it. "You're safe now. We need to get you out of here." I nodded numbly, still too disoriented to respond properly. My body felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy, bruised, and broken. But I had survived. Somehow I had made it out alive. I tried to stand, but my legs wobbled beneath me, threatening to give out. The officer quickly supported me, his grip firm but gentle. "Take it slow. We're almost done here." I could barely register his words as they sank in. Asterisk almost done here star. The chaos had ended for me, but the story wasn't over. I glanced over at the wife and killer, now sitting on the floor, handcuffed, their expressions full of hatred and disbelief. I didn't feel any pity for them. They deserved every moment of pain they had caused. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The suspicion that I wasn't the only one who knew what they had done, what they had planned. I swallowed hard, trying to push the thought away, but it clung to me like a shadow. The officer helped me to my feet and guided me toward the exit, his presence a constant reassurance. "We've got a team waiting for you outside. They'll take care of everything." I nodded, still not fully grasping the situation, but something inside me started to break through the fog. As we walked out of the room, I looked back one last time. The walls, the blood-stained floor, it all seemed so surreal, like a nightmare I would wake up from. But I wasn't dreaming. This was my reality now. I stepped outside, and the cold night air hit me like a slap, shocking me back into focus. The officers had secured the area, their movements swift and practiced. A medic rushed toward me, checking my vitals before gently guiding me to an ambulance. I climbed inside, my legs still shaking, my body heavy with exhaustion. The door shut behind me, sealing me off from the nightmare I had left behind. But I couldn't escape it, not yet. The questions lingered. The unknowns. Why had they chosen me? How had they known I would be the one to reach out? What other pieces of their plan had I unwittingly become a part of? The medic asked if I was okay, but I couldn't answer right away. I could still feel the weight of their eyes on me, even though they were no longer in the room. I turned to look out the window of the ambulance, staring at the blur of lights outside. I had survived, but I wasn't sure if I would ever truly escape the grip of their twisted game. The lights from the ambulance flickered as we sped through the night, my thoughts still tangled in the chaos I had just escaped. I felt detached, like a part of me had stayed behind, locked in that cold, blood-soaked room. The medic's voice broke through the fog in my mind. "We're almost there. Just a few more minutes." I nodded, but I wasn't sure I heard him. My mind was too full of questions, too full of them. The killer's eyes, the wife's smile, the feeling that I was just a pawn in a game I hadn't fully understood. The city blurred outside the window, the lights streaking past like stars fading into the distance. But I couldn't escape what had happened, no matter how far I went. As we pulled up to the hospital, I could feel my chest tightening. Was I safe now? I couldn't answer that. The ambulance stopped, and the medic turned to me, his expression serious now. "You need to be examined. They're waiting for you inside." I nodded, but didn't move. I felt numb. My body was sore, bruised, but it was the weight of the uncertainty that paralyzed me. The doors of the ambulance swung open, and a team of doctors and nurses rushed toward me, pulling me out of the vehicle and onto a stretcher. I barely registered their words as they worked, prepping me for tests, monitoring my vitals. My mind was elsewhere, on the twisted game that had pulled me in. The wife, the killer, and the feeling that it wasn't over. "You're safe now," one of the doctors said softly, as they wheeled me down the hall. But it didn't feel like safety. Not really. They could be locked up. They could be behind bars. But what if there was more to the story? What if I hadn't seen everything? I blinked, trying to clear my head, but the questions wouldn't stop. How did they know about me? I whispered aloud, not realizing I was speaking until the words left my mouth. The doctor paused for a brief moment, his eyes meeting mine. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just gave a gentle smile like he was trying to reassure me. We'll figure it out. We'll take care of everything. But I wasn't sure I believed him. The nightmare had shifted, but it wasn't over. I had been a part of something deeper, darker. And I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched still. As they moved me into a room and hooked me up to various machines, my mind didn't rest. I kept seeing the killer's eyes, the wife's smile. The unease in my stomach didn't go away, because somewhere out there I knew the game was still being played, and I was still a part of it. The sterile room felt suffocating, the quiet hum of the machines filling the space as they hooked me up to monitors. I stared at the ceiling, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Something bigger than just this moment. The door opened, and I snapped my attention to it. A man in a suit walked in, his face familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. He was tall, dark-haired, his eyes sharp and focused, scanning the room like he was assessing a threat. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice smooth, calculated. I swallowed, trying to steady my racing heart. "What's going on? Who are you?" His smile didn't waver. "I'm Special Agent Harris, FBI." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. FBI? I hadn't even thought about that. Not once. But I thought they were just criminals, I muttered, my mind struggling to catch up. Just a killer and his wife. Why do the FBI care? Agent Harris took a seat beside my bed, his gaze unwavering. Because this wasn't just any murder spree. They were part of something much larger. A network that's been operating under the radar for years. My heart skipped. A network? What do you mean? I whispered, the words barely coming out. What was their goal? He looked at me closely before answering, as though weighing whether or not to reveal the full truth. We've been tracking them for a while. They weren't just killing for sport. They were orchestrating something much bigger. We believe they were gathering people, victims like you, into their twisted game, a way of testing people's limits, pushing them to the brink. I shook my head, struggling to comprehend. But why me? What did I have to do with their plan? Harris's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite read. That's what we need to figure out. The way you were chosen, it wasn't random. You fit a certain profile. A cold wave of realization washed over me, and my stomach dropped. Profile? What do you mean? Am I part of some experiment? His expression softened, but only slightly. You were selected, for a reason we haven't fully understood yet. But rest assured, we'll find out. A part of me wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but I couldn't. My body felt like it was crumbling under the weight of it all. Agent Harris stood up, his gaze lingering on me. We'll continue our investigation, and we'll keep you updated. You don't have to worry about them anymore. I nodded absently, my mind still racing. But if they were part of a network, then I trailed off, suddenly aware of the chilling possibility. Yes, Harris said, finishing my thought. There are more of them out there, and they're watching. I couldn't breathe. I thought I was safe. I thought everything was over, but the shadows of the past still loomed over me, casting a dark, suffocating cloud. He turned toward the door, but paused before leaving. You're not alone in this. We'll protect you. Just be careful who you trust. The door closed softly behind him, leaving me in the eerie silence once more. I felt paralyzed, not from fear, but from the overwhelming uncertainty. Who else had they chosen? How many others were out there just like me? I closed my eyes, but the questions wouldn't stop. There was no escaping this. The game wasn't over, not by a long shot, and I was right in the middle of it all. The silence in the room pressed down on me, heavier than ever. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest felt tight, suffocating under the weight of what I had just heard. Agent Harris's words kept replaying in my mind. They're watching. Who could I trust now? I couldn't shake the thought that the nightmare wasn't truly over. It had just shifted, morphed into something darker. I forced myself to sit up, my body protesting, my muscles aching from the ordeal. I needed to think clearly, but my mind was still clouded with fear and confusion. I glanced around the sterile hospital room, searching for some kind of anchor, something to ground me in reality. The machines beeped quietly, a steady rhythm that reminded me I was still here, still alive. But I didn't feel alive. I felt like I was being watched from every corner, like there was a presence lurking just beyond my sight. I couldn't shake it. The feeling that the people who had done this to me, who had trapped me in that hell, weren't finished. There had to be more. The thought twisted in my gut, making my hands tremble as I grabbed the edge of the bed for support. I had been chosen, Agent Harris had said. For what? A test? A game? Or worse? I closed my eyes, trying to block the flood of questions, but all I could see was their faces. The killer's cold, dead eyes, his wife's smug expression, as though she knew exactly how this would end. And then the thought hit me like a jolt. What if they weren't just targeting people like me? What if they were targeting anyone? Anyone who could stumble into their trap, anyone who could unknowingly become part of their sick game. My thoughts spun faster. The possibilities. The paranoia. Had they been watching me before I even knew it? Had they been planning this long before I got that strange message? The door opened suddenly, making me jump. A nurse stepped in, her expression calm but concerned. "You're awake," she said, her voice soft. "How are you feeling?" I blinked, trying to pull myself together. I forced a small smile, though it felt foreign. "I'm fine. Just tired." The nurse seemed to buy it, her lips curling into a gentle smile. "That's expected. You've been through a lot." She checked the 4 in my arm, adjusting it with quick, practiced movements. But I couldn't focus on her. I couldn't focus on anything in the room. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here, not with the walls feeling like they were closing in on me. "Is there anyone I can contact for you?" the nurse asked, her voice calm, but I could see the hint of worry in her eyes. "A family member? A friend?" I shook my head, the fog in my mind lifting just enough for me to think clearly. "No, I just need some time. Alone." She nodded, though I saw the flicker of concern in her eyes as she left the room, closing the door softly behind her. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty space where she had just stood. I felt the weight of the silence press in again. I needed answers. I needed to know who was behind this. I stood shakily, my legs unsteady, but determined. I wasn't going to sit here and wait for someone to tell me what happened. Not anymore. I grabbed my hospital gown, pulling it tight around me, and opened the door. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. The lights overhead hummed softly, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay in that room, surrounded by the uncertainty. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. Every turn, every door I passed, felt like it could be hiding something, someone. And then I heard it. A whisper, soft but unmistakable. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The whisper came again. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it wasn't just in my head. Someone was here. I turned down the next hallway, my breath shallow, my body stiff with tension. The whispering grew louder, just out of reach. But it was there. I quickened my pace, turning another corner, only to be met with a familiar face. Agent Harris. His cold, calculating eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "Why are you here?" I demanded, my voice shaking with the raw edge of fear. Harris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one was watching. "They're here," he said, his voice low. "The people who were behind everything. They're closer than you think." A chill ran down my spine. "I thought they were in custody," I whispered, my throat dry. "They are. But there are others, and they're coming for you next." I stepped back, my head spinning. "You need to come with me," Harris said urgently. Now, the walls of the hospital seemed to close in around me. The urgency in his voice snapped me out of my daze. But my body didn't react right away. I wanted to trust him. I wanted to believe that the danger was over. But everything inside me screamed that it wasn't. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw something other than cold professionalism. Something darker. Something that made my stomach churn. "They're already watching you," he said, his voice almost too calm, too measured. "We need to move now. They're closer than you think." I could feel the panic rising in my chest, choking me. Who were these people? How did they know about me? How was I still trapped in this twisted web? Why me? I managed to whisper, "Why are they after me?" His gaze flickered for just a second, but the mask was back before I could catch anything in his eyes. "I can't explain it all right now," he said, his voice clipped. "But we don't have time. They have eyes everywhere." I felt my legs weaken. I can't go anywhere. Not yet." He stepped closer, his presence overpowering in the quiet hall. "You don't have a choice. They won't stop until they get what they want from you." His words echoed in my mind as I processed them. I felt like the world was closing in on me, like I was standing in the center of a storm with nowhere to run. "I won't let them take you," Harris said, his tone hardening. Something in me clicked then, some primal instinct telling me that whatever was happening, it wasn't just about the killer. This was bigger, much bigger. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He glanced down the hall, scanning the empty space. "To a safe house. You'll be protected there until we figure out who's behind this." Safe house. The words felt hollow in my ears, but it was the only option I had. I nodded, though my mind was screaming at me to question him. But I couldn't afford to hesitate anymore. Harris motioned for me to follow, and I did, my feet moving almost automatically. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel every step vibrating through my body, as if I was walking deeper into a trap. We moved quickly through the maze of hospital corridors, avoiding the main areas, slipping past nurses and doctors who didn't even seem to notice us. My thoughts were a blur, frantic, scattered, but I couldn't stop. I needed to escape. I needed answers. "How many of them are there?" I blurted out, trying to make sense of everything. "Too many to count," Harris replied, his voice low. "The network is vast. We don't know how far it reaches, but they've been operating for years, gathering people like you, testing them, and now they want something from you." I opened my mouth to ask more, but he held up a hand, silencing me. "We're almost there." We reached a door at the end of a narrow hallway. Harris unlocked it, and we stepped into a small, dimly lit room. The walls were bare, the only furnishings a single bed and a desk with a few papers scattered across it. It looked like a place for surveillance, not comfort. Harris closed the door behind us and quickly locked it. "This is where you'll stay for now," he said, his voice cold, detached again. "Stay out of sight. Don't trust anyone." I didn't argue. I couldn't. He walked toward the desk, pulling out a chair and sitting down. His eyes never left me. "Don't leave this room," he said, his tone final. "I'll be back soon." And just like that, he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me in the dim, claustrophobic space. I didn't know how long I stood there before the feeling hit me again. The feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced around the room, my senses on edge, but there was nothing. Nothing but the silence. But it wasn't just silence. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, the kind that made you feel like someone was waiting, watching. I turned back toward the door, my heart beating faster. I couldn't stay in here. I couldn't sit idly by and wait for someone to find me. I had to do something. But what? I knew I couldn't trust anyone anymore, not even Harris. He might have saved me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. I needed to get out of here. But how? My mind raced, piecing together fragments of everything I had learned, everything I had seen. I wasn't just a victim of random violence. I was part of a plan, a larger, more intricate scheme that I still didn't fully understand. And the question echoed in my mind again, louder than ever. What did they want from me? I stood there in the empty room, my pulse racing, every instinct telling me that staying put was the worst decision I could make. The silence pressed against my ears, suffocating. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening, what had happened to me. The door behind me clicked and my heart jumped. For a moment I froze, convinced that someone was on the other side. But when I turned, nothing. No sound. No movement. It was as if the world itself had stopped. I took a step back, my mind in overdrive. The safe house Harris had mentioned. Was it really a safe house? Or was it just another part of their game? The more I thought about it, the less I trusted. The walls seemed to close in on me, not providing protection, but creating an ever-growing sense of confinement. I wasn't alone. I couldn't afford to believe that, not after everything I had gone through. But was there even a way out? Was there any escape from the tangled web they had woven? The whispers began again. They came from the air, from somewhere just beyond my reach. Faint, like voices on the wind. Soft, unintelligible. Yet they carried a weight, a pressure that pushed against my chest. I ran to the door, hands trembling as I pressed my ear against it. Nothing. Was it in my mind? Was I losing my grip on reality? Or was someone out there listening, waiting for the right moment to make their move? I pulled away, heart pounding, fear creeping through me like a cold shadow. Then it hit me. I wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. I had never truly been alone. The game had always involved more than just me. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Heavy, deliberate. I turned to the window. The city lights blinked outside, distant and unreachable. But it was clear now. There was no escaping the truth. They were always watching. I had been a part of their game for so long that I couldn't see the edges anymore. And now, the final move was about to unfold. The footsteps grew louder, each step a slow, rhythmic reminder that I was no longer in control. I couldn't just run. I couldn't hide. The walls of this place, this so-called safe house, felt like they were closing in, and the whispers, that eerie, relentless whispering, filled every corner of my mind. I stood frozen, facing the window, watching the distant lights flicker in the night. The city seemed so far away, a world beyond my reach. I wanted to believe that if I could just make it out there, away from here, I could be free. But I knew better now. There was no true escape. The door creaked open, and I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Harris. He had been watching me, orchestrating everything from the beginning. Maybe in some twisted way, he had been trying to protect me. Or maybe I was just another pawn in this sick game. He stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he stood there, his presence so imposing, his gaze never leaving me. It was as if he was waiting for me to understand. "You know, don't you?" he said, his voice low and almost sympathetic. I didn't answer, but I could feel the weight of the truth settling in my chest. I wasn't just a victim. I wasn't just some random target. I had been chosen, part of something much larger, much darker than I could ever comprehend. Harris sighed, walking over to the desk and sitting down. "This was never about you, not in the way you think." You were always meant to be the key to unlocking something more. I felt my heart drop, a cold pit forming in my stomach. What do you mean? He looked up at me, his eyes filled with something, regret, perhaps. The network isn't just about murder. It's about control. It's about pushing people to their limits and seeing how far they'll go. You were never just an innocent bystander. You were always part of the plan. A shiver ran through me as I realized the depth of the trap I had been caught in. I turned back to the window, my hands shaking. The game wasn't over, and I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a player, and now, with the final move on the table, there was no going back.